February 24th, 1983. Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. The funeral home held the breath of winter inside it. The refrigerated hush of carpet and lacquered wood, the dim lamps, the polished railing along the aisle, the open casket like a quiet wound at the far wall. Don Decker stepped into that hush with his fists already clenched inside his sleeves. He was 21 and out of prison for 48 hours on a furlough. Monroe County Correctional Facility had stamped the leave like they were stamping a bus ticket. And he had walked here from the road without speaking to anyone. People were crying softly. They were telling stories into tissue, muttering blessings into the same air that glossed the cheeks of the man in the box. The man had been called grandfather and sir and the old man. In the mouth of nearly everyone present, he had become gentle, stalwart, a pillar of the small town's vanishing architecture. Don listened from the last row where he folded into the chair like someone settling into cold water. He was not sad. The absence of that sadness was so total that he mistook it at first for calm. Then he realized it had teeth. It was anger, old and exact as a scar. He kept his jaw locked to keep anything from showing. One by one, the living went to the podium to gild the dead. Don stared at the casket lid's hinge until it gleamed like a blade. He did not want to speak to his family. He did not want to be here at all. He was there because the paperwork said he was allowed to be, and because he wanted for 48 hours to be a body that could move through streets without counting doors to a cell. A cousin was at the podium when the room shifted. It wasn't the sound that changed. There was still the cough into a fist, the fibered rustle of suits. It was the temperature. A coolness like a thought he didn't want entered him. He looked toward the casket, and for one elastic second, the dead man's mouth moved. It wasn't a yawn of muscle sinking. It wasn't the mortician's last trick settling under the varnish of the face. It was two lips forming a fraction of a syllable, the way a person shapes the word no or now or name, and the fraction was enough to pull Don to his feet. The cousin stopped talking. People turned. Don didn't notice, or if he did, their eyes were noise and his own eyes were a tunnel. The mouth did not move again. The room cooled further. He left without apology, shoulders sharp as a doorframe passing through a door. Outside, the air was a different kind of cold, clean, movable. He stood on the sidewalk with his furlough papers crinkling in his pocket. There was the family house he could go to. There would be casseroles and the slow knifing grief of condolences. And he could not do it. He walked instead to the Kiefer's rented place, where he knew he could exist in front of a television and not be interrogated by kindness. Bob and Jeannie would give him a plate and the shadowed corner of a couch. Peace and quiet. 2 days of not being measured for a mattress with numbers and steel. They welcomed him the way people welcome someone they've already forgiven for being distant. Come in, wash up, sit, dinner soon. He nodded because nodding's the body's way of signing a paper you can't read. He went upstairs to the bathroom. He turned the tap and splashed his face and held his breath for the first cold and then for the second. The first was water. The second was the air itself, inheriting a chill so fast it felt like he had opened a freezer into his lungs. He raised his head to the mirror to ask himself what this was, and a face looked back from the bevel of the glass. A second face at the edge, too near to the frame to belong to him. An old man's face, lined like bark. Upon it, absurd and unarguable, a gold crown. He turned as if punched. The crown was not in the room. The chill remained. His wrist burned a small, unreasonable pain. He looked down and saw fresh scratches cross-hatching the pale bands where handcuffs had worn at his skin. He rolled his sleeves down until cloth caught them. He he did not examine. He left the water running briefly, a human mistake, shut it off, and went downstairs to the smell of food. He ate quietly with the Kiefers. Jeannie carried plates to the sink. Bob flipped channels like he was moving pebbles in his hand. Don leaned back on the couch and pretended to let the television hold him. In the corner of his vision, his hands were not entirely his, as if they were being described to him from another room. Bob, who had known him for years, watched him for a while. Don's stillness wasn't unusual. He'd always been laconic, his voice the color of drywall. But grief made new angles on his face. Bob let the silence do the speaking that failed men sometimes needed done. Only the house began to speak instead. It was soft at first, an idea of a sound, the suggestion of moving water, a low-traveling hush, a creak hidden under the floorboards. Bob glanced at the coffee table for a spilled glass. Nothing? He looked toward the kitchen, toward Jeannie. She shook her head. The hush became a syllable. A drop struck Bob's scalp. He looked up. Water was shaping itself through the ceiling, not in a single urgent bloom, but in several transparent mouths opening on the plaster. He stood and swore under his breath, shouted toward the kitchen that a pipe had burst, and called the landlord. Before the sentence was fully understood on the other end of the line, the landlord and his wife were there, stamping cold off their boots, breath of fog in the doorway. Up the stairs they went, two at a time, the landlord and Bob, down the hallway, into the bathroom where the tap was off, into the bedroom where the floor was dry, kneeling to press an ear to the baseboards, to listen for a hidden river. There was no river. There was no plumbing above the living room at all. They returned to the stairs with the confusion you wear when you've been told you have misplaced your own hands. At the bottom, they entered new weather. The living room had become a slow rainfall. Water was filming down the paint of the walls, beating at the seams of picture frames, collecting in the knuckles of the ceiling and letting go. The rug darkened in a spreading geometry. And on the couch sat Don, perfectly still, as if riveted through the cushion to the floor. His lips drew back from his teeth in a smile that didn't make it to his eyes. His fingers made a small movement, a rolling of tendons under the skin. Bob said his name once, then louder. Don? Nothing. Only the tendons. The landlord fetched towels and a dread no bucket fits. Someone called the police because there was nothing else to call. Two officers arrived, Patrolman John Baujan and Richard Wolberg. The house met them with a smell that was not yet rot, but was the preface to rot, the damp rehearsals of wood and wool. The men looked around in a training that had not prepared them for water to issue from walls, from ceilings, from floor, from iron. They were not prone to melodrama. They were trained to carry a scene in their eyes until it could be put into a report. What they saw resisted sentences. They saw, too, the young man on the couch with the rictus and the moving hands. They called their chief. When the chief entered, the room made a fool out of protocol. He took in the Kiefers' pale faces, the landlord's agitation, the spreading water, the man on the couch. He said, in the vocabulary of a town that must name things ordinary to survive, that this was a plumbing problem. He told his officers not to write this up. They left with that instruction folded under their tongues like contraband. The landlord found a plumber who would come at night into a house whose walls were weeping. The plumber, professional to the bones of his fingers, lifted and tapped and tracked, angled his small flashlight into seams, listened to pipes that refused to confess. He declared he could find no rupture. He stood a long moment at the threshold of the living room, looking at Don's stillness, at the hands that flexed like they were testing a wire. He said he would return in the morning with someone else. He did not. It rained in that living room for 2 nights. Between towels and buckets and the futility of trying to dry a sky, Jeannie watched Don's face like a nurse watching a fever. Once, late, when his head sagged and sleep finally overtook him, without changing the set of his mouth, Bob leaned in to see if the slackness was peace or something else. He saw the marks then, red scratches coiling the throat, the scallop bruises at the line of the collar. He called for Jeannie in a voice meant to hold steady. On the inside of Don's shirt was a trickle of dried blood, the astonishing lone color in a room gone to gray. Don woke without waking, back into the unnatural poise. The water did what water does when a place refuses to accept it. It found new paths through paint. It pooled in the places that would remember it darkest. On the morning of February 26th, a change that felt like a decision entered the room. Don stood up. He walked out of the house without a word, into the winter, into the daylight that steadied itself around him. He left the door open behind him. The walls closed their mouths. The floor stopped shining. The ceiling whitened toward dry. In the sudden quiet, you could hear the house's old radiators laboring to reclaim the world. He went back to the jail. In the cell block, the light was fluorescent and immune to weather. His cellmate, who had never mentioned fear as anything but a joke, stepped back from the door and called the guard with a voice that stripped itself of pretense. The guard came with his own practiced boredom, until he saw the expression on Don's face. It was out of place in a body so young. It was the smile of someone who had learned how to fit his mouth to another person's will. "I can make it rain," Don said, and his voice was a hollow room. The cellmate asked for another cell. The guard, trying to laugh at what fear does to a room, said, "If it could rain somewhere useful. Say, the warden's office." He left the cell block to carry the story and the joke to the man whose office it was. The warden, Dave Keenhold, looked up from his desk before the guard finished speaking. The guard stared a beat longer than manners allow. The warden's shirt was darkening across the chest, a slow map blooming without a spill. The warden touched it with 2 fingers and brought them back wet. The 2 men looked at each other in a suspension that had nothing to do with water. They went together to the cell. There, the cell performed an impossible theater. Rivulets from the ceiling like veins in stone bursting open. The very bars sweating. The concrete floor offering up moisture as if it had learned how to exhale. The odor of something that had died far away and found its way here in a terrible sweetness. Don stood at the back, grinning that grin with no warmth. His fingers flexed like a small argument, reenacting itself under the skin. The cellmate's eyes had gone so bright with terror that they seemed wet, too. The warden removed the cellmate to another cell the way you remove a glass from a table that is about to be swept. He stood for a while in the wet air and let the impossible register. He called a plumber because he was a reasonable man. The plumber found nothing and left before paperwork could require his signature. When you run out of reasonable things to do, you call someone whose work is the mystery of the reasonable. The warden called the jail's minister. The reverend came not as a performer of rituals for outrageously haunted nights, but as a small-town minister who had been asked to look at something that couldn't be set down in any of his ledgers. He approached the bars. Don approached from his side of the world, stopping halfway to mirror the distance. Don raised his right arm. The room answered not with thunder, but with an acceleration. Water came harder. The smell of rot thickened, sudden as a hand pressed over a mouth. Don lowered his arm and rubbed his hands together as if warming them. eyes fixed on the Reverend with an affection that was only attention. The Reverend opened his Bible. He read the words he had memorized, not to impress, not to show authority, but because their cadence had steadied him in hospital rooms and behind barns and on porches, where men whispered the confession of their smallest cruelties. He spoke of spirits and of the unmaking of what seizes them. He told the air to remember who owned it. Something tore loose in the sound of Don's scream. It seemed to start where a person stores effort, in the lower ribs, and climb through the throat like a blade dislodged. The Reverend flinched and had to cover his ears. The warden and the guard did too, from reflex. Then the scream ended like a cut cord. Don's face unhooked from its unnatural smile. He fell, a man who had not permitted himself to sway finally, giving way to gravity. He cried. There was nothing performative in it. It was the sound of someone remembering a long hallway, and the smallest boy at the end of it. He needed time before he would talk. Those who flood do not immediately explain. When the words came, he handed them to the Kiefers in a quiet kitchen on a later day. They came bluntly, one after the other, like lumber set down on sawhorses. He had loved his grandfather the way a child loves the first map of the world he is given. Then, at 7, he learned that the map was a lie. The beatings had been precise and frequent enough to turn the house into a place where the boy understood the geometry of escape better than homework. He had never told it. It had lived under his tongue until it tasted like silence. At the funeral, he said, he watched kindness laid over the old man like a second skin. In that bitterness that rose like a tide from the inside, he had looked to the casket to anchor himself to reality, the reality of a still face, and the lips had moved. He believed now that it was the moment whatever the old man had been became available again. Call it a spirit if you want. Call it the return of harm. Call it a thing with a crown, because crowns confer power without requiring love. He had seen that crowned face at the edge of the bathroom mirror, at the place where glass and air slope into each other. He had felt the scratches at his wrist as if hands had come back from the habit of them. After that, he had felt his body occupied by a will that wasn't his and didn't care to pretend otherwise. He had been locked to the Kiefer's couch in posture and in purpose. His hands had moved because they were being moved. The water, he said simply, was the old man's mischief, or his hatred. And the point was not the water, but the fear in the room and the way it made people scramble. In the jail, it had been the same. And then the Reverend's voice had made a cut in the fabric of whatever had fastened to him. And the scream had been the noise of that fastening tearing out. He did not pretend to understand why the rain chose those days and not others. He did not claim mastery, only a witness's memory. He did not, after those days, make anything rain again. Years passed. People involved did what people do with the impossible. They buried it in their private archives. The police who had stood in the Kiefer's living room did not write it into the official record because the official record demands a world that is repairable with parts. The warden was a man who believed in parts and yet wore the memory of the damp widening on his shirt like an unremovable epaulette. The minister turned the pages of his Bible for hundreds of other needs and found, in the fine tissue of the paper, a weight that hadn't been there before. The Kiefers learned how to sit in their own living room again. Then, in the early 1990s, some of them said it out loud and attached their names to it. 4 police officers, a jail warden, others who had stood in that water, and called it water. Because what else can you call a thing that runs and cools and dampens and will not obey? They testified to seeing a young man held in a posture that hurt to look at, to hearing him speak as if he were borrowing his own body, to watching rooms forget how to be dry where he stood. They told it because sometimes you tell the truth and let it do what it will with your reputation. 9 people, and the accounting of 2 rooms that rained. What remains is the fact that between February 24th and February 26th, 1983, a quiet flood moved wherever Don Decker stood. After that interval, it didn't. He went on with a life that did not require plumbing repairmen, or ministers, or the word possession. If you ask him about the crown, he may tell you that it wasn't metal so much as a symbol, a visible argument that there had been an order of power in his life that nobody in the funeral parlor was willing to name. If you ask him about the scream, he may say it was pain leaving. If you ask him about the rain, he will say it happened, and he cannot make it happen again. The house dried, the cell block dried. The stories did not. A truth can be as damp as a memory and still never rot. It lingers, it clings in the seams, it makes a smell you cannot quite place. And when you go to paint over it, on the right day, under the right light, the old stain shines through. He learned to sleep again, and in the sleep there was sometimes a mirror, and sometimes a boy, and sometimes a mouth about to shape a syllable. The rain stopped. The scratches healed. The jail resumed its fluorescent hum. Yet one question stayed like a watermark under fresh paint. If an abuser can outlive his death inside the person he harmed, by what name do we call the thing that wears the crown? This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.